Thank you very much to those in the room and those watching on the webcast for joining us on week 2 of phase 3, day 2. So day 2, week 2, phase 3, I think is probably the right way to say it. We are really feel very fortunate to begin our morning with 2 of our former commissioner colleagues. Really, when I think when I'll speak for myself because we all started at different times, but when I started as a commissioner in 2013, you go to these conferences and there are folks who really stand out, who really know their stuff, and are clearly head and shoulders above the rest of the pack. And we're very fortunate to have 2 of those individuals with us this morning to talk about the concept of rate making and the modern grid. So we'll begin this morning with David Littell. David is a former commissioner with the Maine Public Utilities Commission, and he is now with the Regulatory Assistance Project. The Regulatory Assistance Project actually has published a wonderful paper. I don't know if it's, Dave, so far, if it's just for us or for public consumption yet.
Put it out. Yeah,
okay, great. It's recommendations for Ohio's Power Forward inquiry. So it's a really great paper. We're very happy to have him here presenting this morning. Now, Dave, you didn't know this, but we are actually going to break at 9:45, and the reason is that there is supposed to be some tornado siren hoopla thing that's going on outside at 9:50, so we don't want the crowd to, scatter or feel concerned about their safety. So we'll break at 9:45, we'll reconvene at 10 o'clock, and whatever ground we haven't covered, we will cover. I think my notion is at that point we'll be at Q&A. So if you don't mind, we'll bring you back up at 10 o'clock just to have another 15 or so minutes of conversation.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you.
Great, absolutely. Okay, David, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chairman Hawk, distinguished commissioners, and esteemed staff of this commission. I've worked for years with your staff and with you, and this commission really stands out nationally for the work that you do, so I commend you for this work. You're covering, I've been trying to watch some of your proceedings, and you're really covering a lot of ground that took me many years to cover, and you're on the end of the hose getting it, but it's going to put you in a much better position to cover these decisions. So thank you. First, I'm going to hit the executive summary, which is our recommendations in our report that we did working with your staff. These are only our recommendations based on the input that we got. First, for performance-based rulemaking, we recommend that you ultimately look at your goals, look at your targets, and create some metrics to gather data so that you can evaluate whether it makes sense or not to set incentives or penalties based on performance-based rulemaking. Why do you do that? Because you need to know where you are to decide where you're going, particularly if you're going to give incentives. You want to ensure you're not giving incentives needlessly to reward a utility for something it would do anyway, so you need to do the baselining. And when we're in this area that's so developing, that's data that you need and that not many commissions frankly have. And over the longer term, you can determine whether it makes sense to have incentives, or you might actually decide, if you have a very transparent process, that you don't need that, because sometimes public reporting, getting stakeholders to focus, getting regulators to focus is enough to move the discussion forward, and I'll go through that in detail. Secondly, we note that it is absolutely crucial to get the price signals right to consumers, and we'll touch on that, and I know you've talked about that a little bit already, and to ensure that the process and the rates are transparent. And lastly, it's important to remove the throughput incentive, so we'll talk about that. And with that, I'll note that the lead author of the report just walked in, Janine Mignon-Ostrander, who is a particular expert, I would say, on decoupling. So if you have questions there, I may ask Janine to do that. And I was worried that the weather would delay my colleague, so I'm glad to see that she's here. Okay. In short, the metrics that we thought made sense based on the Commission's past work and what you've done are perhaps to focus on reliability, safety, consumer protections, and on the consumer side to look at encouraging third-party services in general, focus on rate design, demand response, and the development of distributed energy resources. So first, what's changing? You've been over this or your previous, so I'm not going to focus on this, but the energy sector is becoming much more decentralized. It is like the cell phone. I showed an old-fashioned telephone. I didn't show it. We were cleaning out at my grandmother's house, and my daughter said, "What is that?" And I said, "That's a digital telephone." She said, "No, it isn't." I said, "Yes, it is. Things have changed so much in that area." And the same thing's changing in the power sector, right? The things that our smartphones do, we didn't imagine they could do a decade ago. And we're seeing that change. But part of that is dealing with that in the context of monopoly regulation, which makes it a lot harder because we have to recreate competitive structures to simulate what would happen in the competitive market. And we're going to have a lot of different sub-markets here if we do it correctly. So one example of what changed in 8 years, from 2006 until 2014, the number of states that had 0.8% energy efficiency savings went from 3 to 18. That's just one small example of what's happening on the demand side, very small. But what that also points out to me on the energy efficiency side is a very academic point, which is that electricity demand has an elasticity, right? And I'm sure you've gotten testimony in various cases as to what that elasticity is. Economists can argue about that. But clearly, if the price of electricity goes up, the demand will go down. That's why people do energy efficiency, right? Some of them might be green, but for the most part, they do it to save money. And there's a cross elasticity now, too. So people can save on natural gas or fuel oil if they invest in certain electrical equipment. I have a teenager at home. I recently had the opportunity to buy a new car that was unplanned, and I decided to try out an electric car, right? And they work great. I mean, it's amazing. It's also a hybrid because Maine has large, extensive distances, so I need to cover them. But I've calculated that when I am operating on electricity, I'm paying about $1.70 per gallon. And the car is a great deal because they don't sell well in Maine, so I got great rebates, and I hope when I do my taxes this year, it looks like the car will, be a great deal all the way around. So I can save on gasoline, move over to the electrical side, and that's a good story for everyone, right? Except for the gasoline distributors. So we need to look at these things. So performance-based rulemaking, all regulations, incentive regulation. This is a quote from Peter Bradford, former Maine commissioner, Maine chair, and chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. What are the built-in incentives to our traditional cost of service regulation? One is the capital bias. It makes sense if you're running a utility to build things. That's how you increase your returns, and you get a traditional rate of return on it. Secondly, particularly between rate cases, you build your business by selling electricity. So if I'm a utility executive, what I would traditionally do is want to increase my sales and build things. That's how you increase your business. If you're privately owned, that's how you show your shareholders you have a strong future. Secondly, in between rate cases, in particular, you want to decrease your operational expenses because that'll increase your profit margin. And you want to avoid disallowances. That's a great thing, right? You don't want to do imprudent things, except that it can result in sort of a lack of innovation, a conservatism at the utility level. And I think it's, at least in my experience, it's pretty clear that you see that. The way that the cultures of utilities are different than the cultures of competitive enterprises. So that's what we have with traditional regulation. What performance-based rulemaking would do is look at your goals, whatever they are at a high level, and set directional incentives. Those directional incentives would specify measurable performance criteria. Measurable performance criteria are, in short, quantitative measures of the incentives, ideally built on objective information for power sector measurements. So what are these? You're familiar with some of the most basic ones. They're expressions of energy or capacity, the reliability metrics, energy efficiency. But in the area of distributed resources, we're not quite sure what they should be set, right? All the jurisdictions that are looking at this are not quite sure. So again, we need to look at it and consider it. So again, these are some of the areas that we've identified for you perhaps to focus on. And you've heard a lot of experts talking about these areas, so I'm not going to go into them in more detail except to just mention the last two. Advanced metering infrastructure. AMI meters have become the meters of choice, right? A lot of utilities, including yours, have installed them. Are they being used for their full potential? No, they're not in very few jurisdictions. They're there. They're being used to charge ratepayers. They're recovering on them. But is the data being used? That's a question obviously you've been asking and you focused on yesterday. How can they be used? That issue is really in front of all commissions nationally. And EV charging is coming up as an issue. It can be done very efficiently, or it can be done very inefficiently and put a lot of stress on our distribution systems. Now, again, I'll talk about myself. What I should do is set it to charge in the middle of the night. But I don't have the option for a time of use rate with my utility that works. And since I just bought it 6 months ago, I just haven't gotten to it yet. So I do what all ratepayers do, who, or most would do anyway, is I plug it in when I get home. Is that efficient? No. So am I going to set it? Yes. Am I going to set the voice feature? Yeah. I mean, we do all that. So right now, I am putting more pressure on the distribution system than I could otherwise, and I'll talk about that. I'll come back to that in a second. Multi-year rate plans. PBR has been used for over 2 decades to use and install multi-use rate plans in a number of jurisdictions. What a multi-use rate plan is it simply sets a rate, sometimes with a rate cap, and allows a utility to share in or, in the case of some, to keep all the savings if they operate more efficiently. They're very effective. Oftentimes, they've been raised by commissions, and the commissions and the regulators are more enthusiastic about them at first than the utilities because it will get them out of doing rate cases every year. And that is a significant regulatory burden for your staff and for you. But what utilities have found is that when they operate under them, it can actually improve the culture of their management, allow them to focus on their operations to save money, instead of focusing on the next rate case and coming in before the commission. So many utilities that have operated under them find them to be beneficial as well. This graph, it comes from Mark Lowry, who's an academic who usually works with commissions and regulators, who's done productivity analysis of utilities. And this compares utility in my state of Maine, Central Maine Power, that operated under several versions of multi-year rate plans, and their productivity in the blue line compared to the average productivity of utilities over the same time period, about 2.5 decades. And you can see that the productivity of Central Maine Power was substantially higher than the productivity, if you, the same graph with the average of those utilities that use multi-year rate plans shows increased productivity. So they work under certain circumstances that, and they may be more challenging under other circumstances, but essentially they say, and send a signal to the utilities to control cost. If you operate more efficiently, you get to save part of the savings, and utilities have responded to that. Now, Ohio has successfully used shared savings in the context of energy efficiency. So the question is, what might be the next steps for how you can set this up going forward in a way that makes sense? So I'm going to return to the point I started at in the beginning. Metrics and PBR can take at least 3 different forms. The first form you might call performance-based rulemaking light, which is public metrics only. That's operating with a very transparent process to set the metrics, ideally with a lot of stakeholder input, and then publicizing them on a website, using a dashboard. A lot of commissions have done that so that they're very publicly available. Just that act of publishing them through a transparent process and working on them can motivate the utility and the stakeholders to work together and to achieve things. And one example of that that immediately comes to mind is the Illinois Commission under their Energy Infrastructure Modernization Act, really focused on real-time rates. Illinois are big commission on markets. Illinois is sort of a center of markets, and they wanted ratepayers to have the option of adopting real-time rates. So part of the arrangement where was the utilities got AMI meters, their commitment was to real-time rates, and they publicized the number of ratepayers who've either taken real-time rates in terms of the percentage and the total number, or for competitive suppliers, those that have adopted the data, the infrastructure interface options, so those that are taking real-time rates through competitive providers. And they have very substantial numbers that are on real-time rates in Illinois, and all they've done is they've used it through a public reporting mechanism to track what's going on. And it allows the utilities to issue reports on the amount of savings that are achieved for those ratepayers compared to their ratepayers that are on flat standard offer service. So an example of just public reporting metrics. Another option to take it a step farther is to do public reporting metrics and then rank the utilities to compare them. That has been done in Europe with a Danish system operator on reliability metrics. Now, are utilities going to like it? No. Do students like to be graded? No. Ideally, you're not. They all have individual circumstances, right? You all have different systems. It's not fair to compare them. Of course, it's not fair to compare students. They all have different circumstances. But it can allow for a measure of competition, and it can allow ratepayers to say, hey, wait a second, reliability or customer service. Why is the reliability of my service worse than the reliability of this other utility? It can set up a very salutary sort of comparison. And ideally, one thing I was frustrated by as a commissioner when we looked at reliability metrics is SAIDI, SAIFI, they're measured slightly differently across each utility service territory and certainly between states, so they're not completely comparable, right? So when I asked staff, how are we doing on reliability? We really couldn't compare our utilities in Maine completely to utilities in other states. That's frustrating because I would like that information. I know members of the public would. I know I've dealt with a lot of reporters who'd like that information and have frankly given up because you can't compare it. It's not comparable. You could set this up in a way that allows your ratepayers to compare metrics that are important publicly for them. Reliability, customer service at a minimum, but maybe how they're doing on other measures as well. And the last version is full performance-based rulemaking. You attach incentives, whether they're negative or positive, and you move forward from there. And they ideally would be substantial enough to motivate the utility as a substantial portion of earnings to take certain actions. And that's, for example, what New York Rev is doing or what Rio in the UK has done. So ideally, PBR would harness this very disruptive sort of activity we have going on with a lot of distributed energy resources becoming more economically available. What do I mean by harness disruption? I don't mean pick outcomes, right? What I mean is pick direction. You can't specify how things are going to come out, but you can do modeling. We do have a sense for the direction that things are developing, and we just don't know exactly how. So you can look across different scenarios for what might happen in the future. You can set the parameters for what the possible scenarios are, and then you can pick the direction in terms of performance incentives and direction that you want the utilities to go in. And you can let them figure out how to do it most efficiently and reward them based on how well they do getting there. Or in the case of some things that may be appropriate, such as reliability, to have a negative incentive. That's how you can harness this disruptive, these disruptive areas and encourage competition to develop. So making the price signals clear to customers is critical, right? Ideally, in a competitive market, marginal pricing occurs based on the cost to produce and distribute a good, right? Economists will tell you that. I've been lectured on that by economists at the RTO level. It doesn't include the fixed cost or the sunk cost. In a competitive market, that's just not the way economists will tell us things work. Prices communicate economic costs to customers, so they're important. And marginal pricing, if it's done right, will allow customers to make efficient decisions that also achieve the lowest cost decisions for the market and for society writ large. So, do customers pay attention? Well, they certainly make economic decisions. The decision I was talking about before is borne out by a study in Dallas and Fort Worth on how EV users will typically respond if they just have an ordinary flat rate. They'll get home, and in the evening, between 5 and 6, you'll see a huge spike as they plug in their cars and they charge. Perfectly rational economic behavior. If, on the other hand, you give them a price break with a time of use rate, in San Diego, they performed a pilot with a substantial reduction at midnight. And what behavior did you see? You see the load curve there. You don't see a lot of charging, just a slight bump in the evening. And then when the price discount went into effect, the charging occurred at midnight and afterwards. So consumers can respond. But it can be taken a step forward with advanced modernization if you provide aggregators or companies that are interested, incentives, and the information through smart meters and the data systems to get the data through the utilities to them, or their own meters, which is a separate issue. You can take it a step farther. This is a typical load curve with a time of use rate in California, and you can see folks, let's go backwards a second. You can see in the evening some people plug in. Those are the price insensitive folks who probably own Teslas, right? Doesn't matter so much. But again, at midnight, you see a large increase. BMW proposed a system to just have 40% of their cars under their control to modify this behavior, because what they proposed, and they can do it in real time, is that in the middle of the day, when California has a huge spike in solar, they can charge and absorb that. They can get rid of the evening peak entirely by turning it down, and then they can also modify that midnight peak because the wind coming off the Altamont Pass and the other wind power facilities in Northern California peaks later. It peaks 2:30 or 3 in the morning, so they can move the peak there and still have the cars fully charged. So economically efficient through aggregation and through control. But the commissions, right, and the RTOs need to set up the right rules to facilitate this to happen. And it's complicated. It's complicated in all jurisdictions. It's particularly complicated in PJM. But these problems can be solved. So in terms of the pricing, I'm just going to touch on, this is all hypothetical, a couple different pricing structures that communicate the pricing structures to ratepayers. One is straight fixed variable, which you can generalize and say assumes that the distribution system is largely set up for the customers. What this does is result in a fairly large fixed charge for customers, and the rest of the rate, the volumetric charge, would be much lower, right, in percentage terms. So it does a couple things. In terms of consumer behavior, it communicates a signal that if you use more electricity, it costs less to customers. It also has an impact on low-income customers who use less electricity. Those low-income customers would pay larger electricity bills. And for customers that use a lot of electricity that have EVs, it communicates a signal you can use more, right, that it's efficient, so you'd increase usage. But if your long-term marginal costs for electricity usage on the system is greater than that actual marginal cost, then you're sending the wrong economic signal, right? Because you're encouraging usage that may not be economically efficient. Now, my sense as a commissioner is that it's pretty high, right? And why do I have that sense? Well, and I'm overgeneralizing here. I'm trained as a lawyer. I'm not an economist. But if you look at the Handy-Whitman Construction Index, right, that is what you use for distribution or transmission costs, that's always higher than the rate of inflation. It's been higher for years than the rate of inflation. So building new infrastructure is expensive, right, however you do it. So if we increase usage the wrong way, we're going to have a pretty high marginal cost. Not a bad thing, but you just take that into account. Another method is the minimum system method, or the zero intercept method, which looks at the minimum size of the distribution system that you can maintain, minimum voltage, minimum power flow, and says, well, we'll attribute that to customers in a fixed charge, and then the rest we'll put in the volumetric charge. That usually results in roughly half, overgeneralizing and simplifying. And there's a basic customer method, which posits that the marginal cost of charge of each customer, residential, we're just talking residential here, the marginal cost of connecting each customer to the system is what we'll charge them. So it's the cost of their service transformer, or if they share it, it's the proportionate fraction. It's the cost of the meter, it's the cost of the service drop, it's the cost of billing that you'd allocate to them, and that's their marginal cost. What this does is it's really marginal cost pricing, but it doesn't provide the revenue stability that the utilities would like, right? So again, if I'm a rational utility executive, this makes me nervous because my revenue may go up and down. I don't have the stability that a bigger fixed charge would have. From a customer point of view, this is, again, hypothetical, but how you might see these play out. The fixed charge for one system is a lot larger than the fixed charge for another system. So now I'm going to shift to how that volumetric charge is set. This charge, I'm assuming that you all have basic familiarity with these types of time variant pricing, so I'm not going to read the slide or go through them. But I'm going to show you 3 examples that have been used by existing utility systems. I pulled these from some Brattle Group slides and just slightly modified them. One is Oklahoma Gas and Electric. They've used dynamic pricing in concert with smart meters and smart thermostats to offer their smart hours program with variable peak pricing. It's an optional program, so about 130,000 of their ratepayers have signed up for it. And the average peak for those ratepayers has dropped 40% under that program, saving the ratepayers 20% of their customer bills. That's substantial. Those are big savings. Maryland has used peak time rebates. So it operates a little bit differently. You get money back for reducing your peak usage. And with that system, has opted in about 80% of their ratepayers into the system, so 2 million ratepayers by and large. They get a substantial rebate when they get that signal from the utility to reduce their usage during peak time events. And it saved the Baltimore Gas and Electric ratepayers alone $40 million since it was instituted in 2013. And ratepayers tend to like it, right? They tend to like it. And this is a sort of a point for commissioners who need to deal with unhappiness from elected officials. Customers, even though economists don't like peak time rate, they say it's not a real time of use rate. And you can debate that, but customers like getting things back. People like rewards better than they like high prices because they tend to perceive a high price as a penalty, right? You tend to forget over time why your electricity prices went down, and then if you're hit with a high cost in the middle of the winter, in the middle of the summer. So, I mean, I should say Maryland and the utilities and the commission have really done it right. They've reduced their peak usage about 16% overall, and this is for 80% of their ratepayers. So the difference is this is most of their ratepayers. Oklahoma Gas was an opt-in, so they've got greater peak time reductions, but for a much smaller percentage of their overall ratepayers. And they're looking at time of use rates. We're working with them on some additional time of use rate pilots to look at how they might move forward. The last point in parentheses on the last bullet, also transmission and distribution time of use rates. Those utilities have acknowledged that their distribution rates too can be set on a time of use. Because why? Does it make sense? Of course, you build out distribution infrastructure to serve peak, so there's a peak aspect to it. And that's a major point of contention or difference in the different states that I'm working in. Some of the utilities are willing to go there. Some of the utilities stand by the position that their infrastructure is all fixed and isn't subject and shouldn't be subject to variable peak pricing. But of course, you can do it. You can allocate those demand costs. You can allocate capacity costs and transmission costs from PJM. You're in PJM, Maryland's in PJM, to the peak period, which is exactly what the utilities and all the stakeholders are looking at doing in Maryland. And in Australia, a distribution network in Victoria has a very substantial dynamic peak payment for reducing usage during peak times. It's allowed them to avoid upgrading low load factor distribution feeders by providing this very high $5 per kilowatt hour rebate when they call on it. So it can be done. It can be done efficiently. It's different. It's different than the signals that we send for our utilities nowadays. By and large, if you're looking at a time of use rate, the two determinants for how ratepayers will respond across hundreds of studies that have been done are the ratio between the peak and the off-peak. They'll respond to higher ratios. So this shows you that in terms of peak reductions, every 10% increase in that ratio will result in about a 6.5 decrease in electricity usage. Or if you use enabling technology, right, and I don't have my cell phone with me, but if you use enabling technology, right, a lot of those studies were done before cell phones. Now it's very easy to send a price signal via a cell phone. You don't have to be home to turn your equipment on or off. You can actually do it electronically. When I got into the hotel last night, I checked on the temperature in my house to make sure everything was still A-OK, right? You couldn't do that 5 years ago. At least I couldn't do that 5 years ago. So it's now very easy to send a price signal, and with that, you get a substantial uptake. You actually have greater peak reduction than your price ratio increase. The other factor that is on this slide is the time period of the peak period. If the more narrow it is, the more ratepayers can respond. So if it's 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours, you give them a period they can plan on. If it's 12 hours, like a lot of the utilities in the Northeast, that's not really workable, right? I mean, it's workable for someone to tell their kids, not for my kids, but I'm just happy if they're doing their laundry, right? But it's helpful for an adult to tell them, look, turn on the dryer after 9 p.m. To say you've got to turn it on after 11 or 12, that's a different price signal, right? It doesn't work so well. If you can automate it, it makes sense. So if you have a button on a lot of new dryers, you can say, 4-hour delay. That works. So technology is catching up with us. But the more narrow the window, the studies are quite clear, the more price response you'll get. Ensuring the process is transparent is very important. I came from the environmental side. I was an environmental commissioner before I was a public utility commissioner. The environmental regulation works very differently. You're constantly getting pummeled by what we call stakeholders in the energy world, but are really members of the public, right? And it's hard. I mean, having your decisions and your staff's decisions constantly questioned it can make you uncomfortable. And in my experience, it makes utility commission staff and commissioners very uncomfortable because you're just not used to dealing with it. But I can tell you, the decisions were always better in the end. And ordinary members of the public with no training often would find errors in what was going on. I mean, people are, they'll dig in it if it's important. So you ended up with a better outcome in a lot of decisions, even though it was uncomfortable. So in our paper that we wrote for NREL, each of these criteria are noted. I've just focused on the transparency and the public review aspects, which is important because when you get to the end of awarding rewards or penalties, but particularly if you're giving the utility, you're saying, you know what? You did these things that we said were important, and so we're going to give you a 200-point ROE bump up. If you've had transparency the whole way, the public can say, yeah, that makes sense. They've done a great job of integrating EVs, solar panels, achieving peak reductions. It saved us even more in distribution infrastructure. Whatever you've decided to do, the public can see that and say that makes sense versus showing up and saying it's a rate increase and it's going to kill us, which is the other perspective you'll hear. And obviously simple is good. To the extent you can keep it simple, that helps everyone, right? It helps you and objective. I just want to distinguish in terms of the ultimate outcome. Outcomes are a little bit different than what we call outputs. Outputs are exactly what the utility does in terms of meeting the performance metrics that implement the criteria, that achieve the directional targets, that achieve the big goals that you want. But the output, you always have to think in terms of the ultimate outcome, what's important to the public. So reliability is meeting particular SAIDI and SAFE or CAIDI requirements. The public doesn't really understand what those are, but the outcome is reliable service, right? And they understand that. So if you can rank them on whether reliability is getting better or worse, that's a very meaningful metric to the customers. And disconnections per month, again, that might not make sense, but it does relate directly to universal service, which is important. And there's a great diversity between utilities across the country that isn't appreciated in how utilities approach that and achieve those. So again, outputs are what you get out. Outcomes are the important input on society. Lastly, I'm going to talk about removing the throughput incentive. Throughput incentive means utilities want to sell more, right? And that is in traditional regulation, it did a good job of simulating competitive markets because in a competitive market, you do better if you sell more. So we sent the right price signal. But in a modern market, that's not necessarily the right signal. One, we don't always think selling more makes sense. It also can force incredible infrastructure improvements that may not be as economically efficient as reducing peak, as in the case of Australia that I just showed you. Decoupling can achieve this. A number of different mechanisms can achieve it, but decoupling can usually achieve it most efficiently. Decoupling has to be done very carefully, right? You have to get in and do it. In my jurisdiction of Maine, in the early 90s, decoupling was instituted and the mechanism was not designed well. It just really focused on sales. So when we went into the recession of the early 90s, the utility received a huge windfall because usage went down, and they got $80 million for going into an economic recession. It was not designed well. It didn't have an index to look at economic activity. So really, things have advanced a lot since then, but it wasn't until 25 years later that the stakeholders in Maine were willing to even consider decoupling because of that very negative experience. So it needs to be designed right. It needs to be designed carefully. I'm going to go through some of the criteria on this. And again, Janine really is one of our experts on this. It is not an incentive mechanism, but it removes a negative incentive to sell more. And it fits well together with performance-based rulemaking. I think I just talked about these points, so we'll keep going. At the end of an agreed-upon period, you true up what's happened. So if the utilities you've determined is entitled to a certain revenue requirement and sales have dropped or sales have increased, you true it up based on the mechanism that you've agreed to. I'll talk about a little bit more rates. Rates are reconciled, and they can be reconciled in a number of ways. So this is an example of a decoupling adjustment. From the rate case, you determine that they're entitled to a certain revenue at a certain rate, which is the price, and what their sales would be. If the actual sales went down, then you make a slight adjustment based on that, and you'd adjust rates. This is also an example of an adjustment, but this one is done on on a per customer basis, which is another way to do that. When do you want to do this? Well, if you're growing, utility will say, well, look, we're adding customers, so it doesn't make sense to cap us. Or if you're shrinking, I mean, that's the other way to look at it, which some utilities in, I don't think Ohio, but some utilities are really shrinking in certain parts of the country. So you might want to do that. Again, you have to really think about the mechanism. Overall, the experience has been, if you design a well-designed symmetric decoupling mechanism, is that the adjustments are rather small. And what this slide shows is that they're both positive and negative. If they're symmetric, if sales actually go up, then you'll take some money back, right? And that's a good symmetric design. You have to focus on it. If I'm a utility executive, I want to minimize the refund option, and I want to maximize the surcharges that'll come out, so you need to focus on it. But the point is that usually the adjustments are quite small, between 0 and 1% of overall rates. That's been the experience. So a little bit more on the design. You need to decide what's covered. You need to choose how you're going to make the adjustments, on what basis, and how you're going to handle those refunds or surcharges, and then how you're going to deal with particular customer considerations. So a little bit of detail on each of those. Are you going to cover just the T&D or the generation? You're restructured, so typically you don't handle it. You shouldn't be asking this question, I think, if I understand the way things work in Ohio. You want to decide whether you're going to include all riders or just basic rates. You want to look at the frequency of the true-up mechanism. So are you going to true-up monthly, or are you going to true-up annually, or are you going to wait till the next rate case? You've got all those variations. Very important consideration is are you going to true-up through the rate of return, or are you going to look at modifications to the capital structure through the formula that you would adopt? Are you going to have a revenue adjustment mechanism? You can have none. You can just wait until the next rate case. You could have stair-step adjustments. You could also have indexes for economic growth or other types of deal. You can do it on a revenue customer basis, or you can have attrition decoupling that periodically adjusts your up and down based on certain attrition factors that you'd put into a formula. And by the way, RAP has 2 publications on decoupling that we sent to your staff, so you have as much reading as you want on this in detail, or your staff do. Now, I remember getting things from RAP when I was a commissioner, and I said, well, this is a lot of text here. So we're trying to do better with the graphics and the tables that I've emphasized this, are really helpful to people that are very busy. 20 pages or 40 pages of text, that's kind of hard to penetrate, because you know what? I'm sure you read 800, 1,000 pages a week, right? So hopefully it's useful to you. But it has a lot of these factors in it, and we're happy to come back and work these factors through with you if you want to focus on it. A K factor is an adjustment to revenues that might be appropriate. You have similar factors in multi-year rate plans, by the way. So a K factor can be, in that context, a productivity factor. You can do a lot of things, including in the context of a multi-year rate plan, different than decoupling, add a productivity. Say we expect you to get more productive, right? You'll have an inflation adjustment perhaps, but you'll also have productivity adjustment. Or you can do a hybrid of the different choices. So one thing that's also important is in designing the refund mechanism is how are you going to do it? Are you going to do it across the board? Are you going to do it by rate class? Are you going to do it to particular rate elements? I mean, those are all things when you set up the formula. They operate differently, and you have to look at distribution across different rate payers, what's fair and what's economically efficient. And caps. Caps are very important in a decoupling mechanism. Are you going to have a rate cap, or are you going to have a revenue cap? Right? They operate differently, and they'll operate differently with other mechanisms in rate design. And so you want to not just think about decoupling narrowly, you want to think about how it's going to work with where you might go on PBR and what rate incentives it creates. Do you want to cap overall revenue, or do you want just to cap rates? Again, they operate differently, so you just need to think that through. So the takeaways, one, are PBR and good rate design works best when it's clear and transparent. If If you do it innovatively, ideally, what we want to do is set up the incentives so the utilities have the same incentives as the customers and the regulators to pursue what's in the public interest and what's most economically efficient, lowest cost overall, right? That's your ideal goal where you want to get to. If you add decoupling in, you're really talking about the next generation, utility, what utility regulation is going to look like in the 21st century. And ideally, you do it in a way that ensures that utilities will be profitable in the short run and the long run, so our investors continue to invest in them, right? Because if they don't have a good business future, private investors aren't going to invest in the utilities, and that's not going to work well for anyone, because then the cost of borrowing goes up, the cost of private equity goes up from a shareholder side, and ratepayers will pay for that. So at the end of the day, the utilities need to be profitable, moving forward with the lowest cost solutions. So thank you again for inviting us.
Dave, thank you very much. Let's go ahead and begin with questions. Dave, I'll ask you the first question, and this will be just a sort of tee-up for the rest of the folks on the dais here. So it sounds to me like there are really three primary components that I think we've got to make some decisions on, and I'm just wondering about the interplay of these three components, and which one you do first, and so the first component is really what performance outcomes do we want from our utilities? I mean, what is it that we are trying to achieve from a performance level from our utilities, however you decide to couch it. And then the second is really what options are there to reward the achievement of those outcomes that you have identified. And then the third, there is also like a very intensive sort of lost revenue piece of this puzzle as well. In your paper, we discuss, straight fixed variable, and where the paper ends up is that decoupling is really the best mechanism when dealing with that lost revenue approach. So I'm sort of breaking out your presentation into those three buckets. What do you think? It sounds to me that the first thing that we'd want to do is based upon some categories: reliability, safety, seamless integration of distributed resources, and the list can go on and on. Those are the performance. We verbally articulate that those are the performance metrics that we would like. These are the performance outcomes that we would like for the utilities to achieve. Then we would say, based upon our sort of rate-making regime and rubric with electric security plans, distribution rate cases, various riders, here are the ways that we could adjust these things if you really knock it out of the park with these outcomes. And then the decoupling piece, can you just fit the lost revenue bucket and the decoupling piece into that framework? So Commission has said, we want you to achieve these outcomes, and then we know how we can possibly reward utilities for achieving these outcomes. And then what does the lost revenue approach and decoupling have to do with that?
Okay. That's a lot. So tell me if I don't address any particular issues. First, absolutely, I think what you want to decide is what your overall goals are, which are the outcomes you want to get to. So that's, I assume freewheeling discussion among commissioners on what's important for the state. It has a time component. There's some things you can tackle next year that you may have good enough data on, such as reliability or safety. There are other things that are longer range goals, and the short range goals may have, some commissions want long range improvements to reliability over a long range time frame as well. So that's the first thing to talk about. If the utilities are proposing large capital investments, that's a very timely discussion, right? What's the cost? What's the benefit to ratepayers? Even if you have a positive cost benefit, then me as a commissioner, as a former commissioner, I'd say, okay, there's a great cost benefit. How are we going to ensure that these benefits are realized? Because the situation we got into in Maine, just before I joined the commission, they'd approved the AMI build out because there was a large chunk of money coming from the Recovery Act. So let's move quickly and get this in place, right? And all sorts of benefits were sort of put forward in the docket. Well, we implemented them, and most of the benefits didn't show up, and turned to the utility and said, where are the benefits? Oh, that's not our job. That's a competitive market. Wait a second. Those are the benefits. So, I mean, it's to ensure that doesn't happen, right? If you're approving large investments or expenditures or repairs are paying for, ensuring that the benefits show up. And that can be done symmetrically. You give an extra ROE, one way to do it is an extra ROE bounce if they show up well, and you have ways to measure that. Or if they don't show up, then recovering fully for that investment may not make sense, right? That's the way the competitive market would work. In fact, in the competitive market, if you do an investment and the benefits don't work out, you just lose, the competitive enterprises lose the money, right? That's the way the competitive market works. It's very different when I was in private practice for 11 years. I represented entirely competitive. I wasn't an energy lawyer, so I didn't regulate the utilities. I didn't represent the utilities. And then as an environmental commissioner, got to utility side, I said, wait a second, their legal costs are paid for, and whatever they do, they'll recover again. It's a very sort of different world. So you want to, in my view, as we move into this competitive area with new technologies, you want to try to simulate the competition a little bit more and see if you can change the culture, or change the culture perhaps with the different subsidies that the utilities would own within the utility. In terms of setting the rewards, yes, you want to get there. If you just talk about rewards and you don't design your mechanisms symmetrically so that there's a downside, you can get into an uncomfortable spot that I've seen other states and jurisdictions get into. Is if you're thinking about a substantial adder, 200 basis points would start to be a substantial right that ratepayers would pay for. It's just additional costs. So then, and even if it's more substantial, if it's something like New York Rev's looking at, or Rio, then you really have to think about reducing the overall ROE and ROR. And that's not something that's good for the utility, right? That's not something they're going to like. So in my view, that I think that really, again, going through it with some commissions, it really reinforces the importance of symmetry, of having it be well designed, because that sends a market. It would allow you to keep the overall ROE and ROR higher where it should be, but reward them if they do a really good job. They can make more, and if it's not so good, then it would be a slight decrease. But the markets, my sense is that the markets would respond more positively to that type of setup. And then on lost revenue, the reason that decoupling generally works better, I worked with a couple commissions that implemented an LRAM simply because the utilities, a lost revenue recovery mechanism that wasn't as symmetric as decoupling, because the utilities were willing to settle on that rather than litigate a full decoupling case, right? That's the way some things happen. But LRAMs are typically just upside for the utility, which again, if you're a rational utility executive, that's what I want, right? But from a ratepayer point of view, it's not as positive, because if it just increases, ratepayers pay for it and there's no downside. A well-designed decoupling mechanism would have fixed the situation that I talked about in Maine in the early 90s. If the economy turned down and there was lower sales because of an economic recession, that's not really something the utility, well, that's a decision for the commission, right? I shouldn't say, but many people would say that's not something that the utility should be able to recover for under a decoupling mechanism, and that's something you could look at. So the symmetry of decoupling, it works well. And the other reason why decoupling is important is because we're in this area now where we don't really know what's going to happen with utility sales. But I wouldn't assume they're going down. I think that's what you'll hear. That's certainly what we hear at NARUC, and that's what the cost is. Energy efficiency experience suggests that. But we now have we have all the major auto manufacturers coming out with a lot of interesting electrical vehicles. And that obviously can grow load, and it can grow sales over the long run. We also have technologies, air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, that are very efficient. So we're going to see a diversity we have demand response technologies that will grow load in different ways. And I think the real challenge is going to be to grow load in a way that helps the utility bottom line without building out a lot of unnecessary infrastructure. So as I talked about with the EV, I mean, it's very efficient to charge EVs in the middle of the night. It's far less efficient to charge them during the peak, the evening peak. And as more solar gets built out, that evening peak, we're going to end up with more of the duck curve type of scenario. So. We're not seeing we're seeing some commissions look at those time of use rates and communicating that, but again, it's not if utilities would benefit from building out that distribution infrastructure, and it's just not something that makes sense. If we can send through whatever mechanism you use, an aggregation mechanism or a market-based pricing mechanism, a signal to customers that makes sense to charge in the middle of the night, you'll have greater utility sales. Over the long run, you'll grow load. The increased sales can make up for energy efficiency and demand response reductions. And at the end of the day, that's part of the profitability centers for the utilities. And if the utilities do better, they should make more money, right? If anyone told me I'd be paying over $100 for a cell phone every month 8 years ago, I would have said, no, I'm not going to pay that. That's not worth it for me. But I do, because the service I get out of it and the options I get out of it are better. And ultimately, utilities can get into that type of situation where they provide a variety of services that customers actually value. It might be a subset of customers. It may not be all customers, but it's value added. And so that's one thing to think of the type of market. Is it just going to be a commodity service? Commodities, if you look at our overall industrial, except for natural gas, where natural gas is, because of fracking, is so much less. By and large, commodity production, we don't do that in the U.S. because of the cost of labor, other cost inputs. So commodities, it's the value-added business that businesses are doing well in. And I think the commissions and regulators have a role in prodding the utilities to say, look, the traditional cost of service model meant that you're protected, you'll always make money, but customers have a lot of options. They want different things. And we think that you can provide more of those and move into this area. And so I'm tempted to say more there, but I won't.
Okay, great. Dan, let's start with you today.
A real basic question for me, could you contrast and compare the revenue decoupling approach or space to just the straight fixed variable rate making? How are they similar? How are they different? And then might have a follow-up question after that. Or am I just totally out of the?
No, I'm always challenged to think about things in new ways.
Off the rails, to think that there's, because obviously I look at it and I think, well, maybe there's some similarities to it. And then the follow-up question is, hearing you talk about the new world of electric distribution services and the comparison to on the one hand to the wireless space and value additions that might be possible, but also listening to the efforts to design rates that provide for more efficiency in the distribution system. It sounds to me in a way like you're talking about not the value add part of it, but the efficiency improvements part of it, that what we're looking to do is to incent, or we ought to think about looking to do is incent the utilities to essentially increase the distribution system capacity factor, that we want to make better use of the existing equipment, the existing investments, or if we add investments, we want to do it in a way that increases the incentive to utilize those additional investments in a more capacity factor measured sort of way. So contrast and compare for me first the straight fixed variable rate making with this revenue decoupling, but then answer me, are we talking about at the bottom of it just improving capacity factor for the distribution system to achieve these efficiency gains?
Okay, good question. The first one first. Straight fixed variable and the discussion there, one way to think about it is what I was talking about is traditional rate making really focused on the utilities. And it was a very technical exercise that commission staff, commissioners, and the utilities understood to make them whole and to make rates work. but it wasn't something, the customer price signal wasn't something we thought a lot about traditionally. It wasn't that important. So very utility-centric, right? We're thinking about the utility and what works for the utility. And what I was emphasizing there is we're now in a new world where how the customers have choices, but not just choices, customers, more information, more options, and so getting the price signal right, and we have alternatives that are increasingly becoming available to traditional generation and even to T&D. So Green Mountain Power in Vermont offers batteries, right? And if they control the batteries, they charge just $10 a month to the ratepayers because they can control them to control voltage and power on their system. That's an alternative to traditional distribution system investment, right? That wasn't available before. So the discussion on straight fixed variable was about looking at how we've used these rate-making methodologies for years that have been utility-centric, and we now need to think about making them customer-centric too, so customers can respond. That's what that focus was. On decoupling, I returned to the old way of thinking because, well, wait a second, the utility might lose money if we do all this, right? And that's not, if they do a good job, the utility shouldn't lose money. They have a revenue requirement. You've gone through a rate case, and the revenue is revenue they should recover. So decoupling returns, in my view, to that mindset of, well, in this new world, we still need to ensure the utilities are profitable, right? They do a good job. We don't want them to go out of business. We don't want their business case to be negative, or shareholders aren't going to invest, bondholders aren't going to issue them the bonds, and then that becomes a downward spiral, right? So I think the focus was very different in the two, but you're right to pick up on the fact that I was talking about changing the mindset in one to the other. So I hope that's helpful. On the wireless and the telephone analogy and improving, yes, there is an aspect to it to improving overall system utilization, the power factor, or the load factor, and using our existing infrastructure more efficiently. So one way to think about it is, what other industry builds out their infrastructure just to hit the demand on 10 hours a year, right? There's no other industry. That's not economically efficient. If you run a bar, you offer happy hour to get people in. If you're a retailer, you offer discounts to get people in early and late, before Christmas and then after Christmas. So that there's an aspect there. But there's also this aspect of things are changing, and more services are becoming available, and customers are really interested. They don't completely understand it. It's confusing to non-energy people what all these options are, but customers are interested in this stuff, and they're increasingly, I think we'll see more and more of that. And so there's an opportunity to respond apart from the efficiency side of it, and to ensure that whatever happens, we're using the infrastructure efficiently and cost effectively to reach low-cost solutions, but also, and I'll add an element here I didn't talk about, resilient solutions, right? Because resiliency, we've got this reliability discussion, they've got, how is resiliency different than reliability? But customers do value resilience. They value it in ability to recover from storms or have temporary, and there's perhaps a role for utilities there as well for investing in that, helping, and I don't think we explore that. So one way I talk about it, Ohio's a northern climate too, is I know a lot of people in Maine will invest in a generator, right? Whether it's temporary or positive, because if you're in a rural area in particular, you lose power, you don't want that. The cost of a generator is $8,000, $10,000. You put in propane if you're not connected to natural gas, that's another $2,000, $4,000, and then for the fuel you'll pay several thousand at least just to maintain it. Well, there's a real value-added proposition there for utilities, right? Not generators, but with solar and/or batteries to provide. You don't necessarily need to power a whole house, right? I mean, for me, what I cared about was having my furnace run, so if I'm here and I lose electricity, my pipes don't freeze. That was what was important to me, but the service, is too expensive. But if I had the same offer that is available in Vermont with Green Mountain Power, that would have been much more efficient than putting in a backup generator. but I made the much more expensive choice because that's what we need. A lot of ratepayers would be there, and I think Green Mountain Power has tapped into this resilience benefit that they can get a distribution system benefit and also have their customers be happier with that option. So.
Just one more. If we were to go down the path of making changes to the traditional way, or the traditional may be wrong way to put it, the current way we have to set rates for the utilities, do you think that we should be doing it through like small steps first, pilots, limited exposure to the customers, or should we just, do you think it's better just to flash cut to a more modern and more a better aligned system of incentives and rates that you've been describing? Is it better to take small steps first, or is it better just to go ahead and make a large step on a broad basis?
I mean, of course, that's up to you. That's a big question. Typically the usual approach for commissions is to try pilots or the small step approach. You gain experience with your utilities, and your staff and the commission itself can evaluate that and look at different options. That's sort of what I would characterize as the traditional American approach. Ontario, on the other hand, just decided they were going to do it, right? California also decided they were going to move to time of use rates, although there have been some pilots done in California, so I'm not sure which area they fit into. But traditionally, gaining experience implementing particularly the IS systems and making sure those work before you transition all your ratepayers over certainly strikes me as the wise way to do it. And hiring utilities could hire experts, you could work with them, and there's a lot of detail in designing that, deciding whether you want to do a critical peak pricing scheme, peak time rebates, time of use rates, and doing pilots. And I'm working with 3 other states right now in designing that type of system to figure out a pilot that makes sense. So traditionally, that's what most cautious utilities and regulators would do in the U.S. context.
Okay, let's try and fly through some questions here, because even with the tornado break, we're already 15 behind. We've got a commission meeting at 1:30 today, so don't forget that, Tom. Go ahead, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming. I just wanted to follow up on Commissioner Conway's question in regards to, I mean, as you travel around the states and having your experiences being on a commission and such, we're somewhat limited, but what are some things that, a couple of things that you think that, my gosh, why wouldn't the commission implement certain things, through a pilot project or just maybe just implement? It just makes so much sense.
What's the low-hanging?
Yeah, 2 of them, I've touched on them, but I'll make them very clear, is one, as we're seeing technologies, I don't know how many heat pumps you have being deployed in Ohio. We see a good deal of them in Maine, and they're popular, right? Because they provide not just heat in the winter, but they provide air conditioning in the summer. We're a jurisdiction that hasn't had a lot of air conditioning. So customers like them, they don't understand how to use them yet. And then we have EVs being deployed. Those can both add a lot to your traditional peaks if they're not managed properly. So providing a structure, starting with the meters, moving to the data that's collected, which, by the way, I heard a lot of the discussion yesterday, not all of it, before I got on the plane. But there's a lot of decisions to be made data is what you tell a meter to collect, right? But it does not exist as an independent set. So, there's a lot of decisions to be made in terms of how you set up the IS systems to even collect that data and what you tell the meters to do. The meters are very capable, but they won't collect data, and the utilities won't keep it in a form other than what you tell them to do. So there's a lot that cycles through the system to the beginning part of that. And, I mentioned that because we've asked the utility in one of the states, what are you doing with this data? And the answer was nothing. It's just getting flushed out of their system. Well, okay. But then it's not available to the third parties who could really use it. So implementing something so that when we're adding these new technologies that customers want, they can go in the direction of lower cost and not adding to peak, that's just so obvious to me that we're going to end up upgrading unnecessarily a lot of distribution substations because the utilities aren't managing that and we're not providing the right incentives. And again, if I'm a utility executive, I don't really want to manage that because if I get to build out my distribution substations, that's good. That's better for my bottom line. So sending signals so they can make a shared savings mechanism that's well designed, or what I call facilitated competition model using some RFPs that incentivize the utilities to make money off of implementing the RFPs appropriately, rather than build out their traditional distribution infrastructure, and having that be at least as profitable, if not more, for them for doing it, is something that screams out for saving money over the long run versus building unnecessary infrastructure.
Beth?
Thanks. A big thank you to you and to Janine and the whole RAP team in working with us for the last 6 months. The staff you see up here were the part of the staff team that worked on and talked with the folks at RAP for the last 6 months regularly. And big thank you to all of you because they certainly helped create this report in terms of providing information to RAP. And so I really appreciate the time and effort you guys have put into it. Also wanted to say, so Commissioner Conway brought this up, and Commissioner Johnson also kind of touched on it. So this notion of whether to do a comprehensive type of performance-based rate making, like I guess UK did, or this layering approach of adding performance-based incentives over our existing regulatory framework or not. And I'm speaking for myself, maybe the layering approach is probably the direction I would be most apt to kind of move into, at least to dip our toes in the water, kind of get a sense of what this is about. So maybe you've already answered this, but this layering idea, how would you layer things? Like, what's the first layer, perhaps, that you would put down? I don't know if you or Janine want to talk about that as far as performance-based rate making.
I'll ask Jadine in a second, but I think you've already done parts of the layers. You've already started. You've set, I think, Safety and Katie, I may be misremembering criteria. Then you separately have set performance criteria for the utilities and said it's a violation of your rules if you don't meet them. But then the follow-through, my sense is you didn't have a clear incentive. You just sort of comes back to you're violating the rules. What are you going to do about it? Well, the signal is not really clear to the utility, right? So you could build on that structure or not. But I think you have, one, started to layer it. And two, most utilities are looking at performance-based rulemaking, and you've also done it for shared savings mechanisms for energy efficiency. You've already sort of started down that road, I think, without thinking about it that way. And so pursuing that or building on top of that makes sense. And again, I think the decisions on what area makes sense is something that you'll have to grapple with. And I don't, other than New York, there's no jurisdictions in the U.S. that are looking at wholesale revamping of their entire regulatory system, and New York is still in the middle of it, right? So we're all watching for how that comes out. And the last thing I'd add is I think your staff is very capable here, so Ohio doesn't fit in the same category as commissions with smaller staffs, but to do a full PBR requires a lot of data, a lot of information, and a lot of process. It takes years to develop those utility plans in the UK and hundreds of staffers who are working on it at Oxfam. So it's a big effort, and whether you want to build out your infrastructure and work with the utilities to do that, my sense is probably the layering approach is something that's a lot more understandable for you and your ratepayers the commission. So adding to that seems to make a lot more sense. Janine, do you want to add anything to that?
Thank you for the question. I think what I would recommend is for starting with performance incentive metrics, maybe identifying 5 metrics that you want to highlight or have the utilities make progress on. It could be reliability, it could be customer service, it could be removing barriers to distributed energy resources. It could be any number of things that the commission feels are the highest priorities. The second question then becomes, do you want to attach to that any kind of incentive? You might want to start off with maybe a year of measuring progress, posting that, having the transparency around it that Dave talked about earlier, or you could go the next level of adding a performance incentive. Some commissions have done, some places are looking at incentives, both penalties and rewards. New York Rev, for example, where I've been doing some work, they're looking at just incentives, and what they've identified a number of what they call earnings adjustment mechanisms, and they've attached among those 5 a maximum of 100 basis points. And so the next step is to say, okay, if you meet this target, you can get this basis point upside in your revenue recovery. But the thing that to be very, very careful about when you do that is looking at what is the value, the potential dollar value to the utility, and making sure that the benefit to consumers and to ratepayers exceeds what that cost that could potentially be paid out to the utility is. So New York is starting very small, with very small amounts. And the way they've addressed it is they've asked the utilities in their rate cases to come in and make recommendations as to what those metrics should be, and the commission has obviously given them very clear guidance on these things, and what the benchmark should be, what the and what the benchmark is that you're measuring from, and what is the outcome that you want to have, and then measuring in between that how many basis points adjustment they could get for that.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Larry?
I just add one more. On the rate design side, if you want to change rate design, you're talking about a ship that's moving, and that every time a rate case is filed, you got to deal with it. That usually requires some separate effort, at least a signal, and otherwise each rate case goes on. You know that as well as I. They're filed. Your staff are then. They're huge efforts. So in the context of a rate case, it's usually hard to ask those questions when you've got statutory deadlines.
Yeah, just very quickly. David, thank you. Janine, thank you as well. David, early in your presentation, you indicated that you don't want to be rewarding utilities for doing what they would be doing anyway. And let me come at it a little bit differently and maybe challenge that and say, well, shouldn't we avoid rewarding utilities for doing what they should be doing anyway? And then I think that underscores the importance of defining the metrics. And I go down the list of metrics, and I'm thinking, well, shouldn't they be providing reliable service? Shouldn't they be affording consumer protections and things of that nature? And segueing, I guess, from something that the chairman said. So it's a results-oriented analysis we're doing. What is it that we want to be the result? One of the results that we've discussed over the past several months is the development of a market and the involvement of non-traditional stakeholders in a new and improved world that provides incentives, as Janine alluded to, for DER and things of that nature. So here's the long and the short of it. I also inferred from your comments that caps are always imposed in performance-based rate making. And I'm wondering if the theory is to promote market development in ways that maybe we don't even appreciate at this point in time. After the cost of the investment is recovered, why do we cap an incentive? What is the theory behind capping an incentive if there's an appropriate sharing mechanism implemented?
Good question. I'll try to unpeel it from the back forward. First, on the caps, the caps occurred in the discussion of decoupling, and oftentimes commissions will put a cap on because, or I'm sorry, a multi-year rate plan. You want to you want ratepayers to be covered for not paying too much. That's where that happens. It's not in PBR. You don't need to have a cap for a performance incentive. In fact, if it's something you think is important, like energy efficiency, the Colorado Commission allows recovery of 5%. If for every 5% of net benefit that their utility recovers over what they expect, 1% of that the utility can keep, right? And there's no cap on that. So if that goes upwards, their decision is that the energy efficiency, at least I believe there's no cap on that. So you don't have to have a cap for PBR if you determine it. And of course, in a competitive market, you wouldn't. The better you do, the better you do. And absolutely, for the premise of your question, you can set the reward incentive. The implication is maybe a little bit negatively if the utility is underperforming. My only caution there is you just want to be sure that you're not making them harder to finance, because if their financing cost goes up, then ultimately that comes up in the rate case, and that's a variable you can't challenge. If Moody's given them a certain rating and downgraded them, their cost of capital is going to go up. Other than that caution, yes, absolutely. And setting benchmarks is one way. The ways of setting baselines are: one, good historic data on that utility. Another way is to model them. A third way is to do benchmarking, and then there's more sophisticated models, but benchmarking against different utilities, and that's what I said I would love in the reliability case. If through NARUC we could, the commissioner could look, let's measure SAIDI and KADI consistently across all utilities so that you can actually compare which ones are providing more reliable service. And then you can get into discussion of, yes, we have more lines down because of winter issues versus tornado issues in other parts of the country. You might have both. But yes, the should and what they should do, that would go to the importance of the symmetry of the mechanism.
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Okay, staff, we will start with you after Mr. Scott's presentation. Everybody, please give a round of applause to Dave Littell. Thank you, David. Okay, up next we have Doug Scott, who's the former chair of the Illinois Commission, currently the vice president, strategic initiatives for the Great Plains Institute. Great friend of the commission, avid Diet Mountain Dew drinker, which we have beat him up about every day that we see him, because I just find that quirk to be so hilarious. But Doug, thank you very much for joining us, and we're sincerely appreciative. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and commissioners, and also distinguished staff members. It's great to be with you. Thank you also for setting me up with the Diet Mountain Dew this morning.
That was all Beth and her aide, Kristen Klingon.
I want to add my congratulations to you on undertaking this project and the really thorough way that you're conducting it. You're going to have a tremendous amount of information. It kind of goes to some of the questions that you've just been asking about, kind of what do we do next, what happens next. And I think that's important, and I think there's some instruction from some of the other states that have or are going through this right now as well. So as you wanted me to do, I'm going to kind of follow on some of the themes that David talked about, and it's always tough to follow David, but I'm gonna try. I thought the report that he and his colleagues at RAP did for you was really, really well done, and really is a great framework for the issues that you're going to need to look at. And since we're talking about all this burgeoning technology, I'm going to do this old school and not use PowerPoint. So I'm just going to talk to you for a few minutes about what's going on, and kind of take the points that David made, but then talk about them in terms of a couple of other states and what they're doing. Maybe just because there isn't any right way or wrong way to do this, just to give you some examples of how other people are approaching this, and hopefully that can be instructive as well. And again, happy to answer any questions while I'm going or afterwards. So however you want to do that is fine. So like RAP at Great Plains Institute, we've been doing a lot of work with a lot of states, a lot of utilities on this issue. We've been one of the facilitators of the Minnesota process, which I'm going to talk about quite a bit here. Since its inception, we worked with RAP in Rhode Island, which I'm also going to talk about because they've done a lot on performance-based rate making, which is going to be the main thing I'm going to talk about here. lots of states are talking about this. They're doing it even if they're not doing it in a kind of a formal way like you are. A lot of them are just doing things through rate cases. May not be, as David said, and I agree with him, may not be the best way to do that, but it is something that's coming up in a lot of different states in different forms. And the key thing, and it came up a couple times in the questions, is the Ohio solution is going to be the Ohio solution. It's not going to be Minnesota's, it's not going to be Rhode Island's, it's not going to be New York Rev, it's not going to be what Hawaii's done, it's going to be whatever makes the most sense for you. And every place is different. The politics are different, the history is different, the utilities are different. I was talking to utilities in one particular state that we were working with, and we were talking about this idea of creating a distribution platform and creating new revenue streams for the utility from that, maybe looking at the ROE and taking that down a little bit, but providing more opportunities both for performance-based metrics and to make money. And one utility said, that's fantastic, here's a bunch of ideas, we'd love to get people talking about that. And the other utility in the same state said, no, the commission will just make it up to us in a rate case if we lose money. So, and that's in the same state. So the difficulty there is it's not just one state to another is different. You could have very dramatic differences within the state. So putting together something that allows you the flexibility to make it work for all of the different entities involved is I think, very important. I think, and it goes to the questions that were being asked here just a few minutes ago, the most important thing is, what do you want out of your system? What goals do you want to achieve out of the system? I think that's the most important thing, because from that, as we're talking about performance-based methods of compensation, it's always going to go back to those goals that you want to set as a commission. What's the most important things for you to achieve with your system? I know you're really interested in customer facing and changing the customer relationship and experience. There are some metrics you can design that go specifically for that, as David and others have talked about here. But again, the idea is to talk about that in a way that is going to make sense for you. And just to go at the start here, to talk about what to do first and how to do this. There's lots of different ways to do that. You can talk about designing a performance metric or a time of use rate, for example, and starting it with a lot of data first, and then do a pilot project, for example. Or you could jump into it with both feet. There's a hybrid way of doing that too, and a time of use rate in Minnesota that Excel is doing. They're designing the time of use rate looking at 10,000 customers on their system, but doing that with the idea of, unless something really strange comes out from what everybody thinks is going to happen, moving right away into implementation on the full scale, rather than take 2 years to study whatever came out of the time of use rate pilot and then taking another 2 years to design something. They want to try to design as much as they can up front and then move directly into trying to move that to all of their customer base. One of the questions that you had asked is whether kind of the traditional cost of service, it gets to the heart of what we're talking about with performance-based metrics or compensation, is cost of service adequate to allow for investment in all the technology changes that are happening? And the short answer is probably not, for all the reasons that you've heard, I know, over the last few weeks, and also what you heard from David's presentation. It's a different goal. The traditional goal here, and not to be pejorative, but because it was a good goal and it served the needs that we had, was to build out a distribution system to bring electricity to everyone, and to build that distribution system out relying most heavily on strong centralized generation through strong centralized distribution facilities, and eventually ending up in our homes and businesses. Well, that's changing, and so it's not that the system's bad. It's that the system was designed to do something that's not necessarily where the technology is forcing us now. So, and I also think that, and David made the point earlier, and I wholeheartedly agree with it, that the traditional cost of service model, and I used to see this as a commissioner in Illinois as well, also inhibits innovation because of the look-back prudency kind of decisions that commissions have to make. And so we saw that really deeply in things like energy efficiency, where we got a lot of programs on lighting, we got the low-hanging fruit kind of programs, and it wasn't that the utilities didn't want to do more, it was that they had to make sure that they were doing things that can meet the cost-benefit analysis at the end of the day when we all look back at it. And that's kind of what traditional cost of service regulation does. So I think that you're really going in the right direction. And I'm going to go through a list of a couple of states are doing, and some of the lists of things that they're looking at. And I'm not doing that to say that this is what you ought to do, or this is what makes the most sense for Ohio, but just to show you the kind of the wide range of choices that you have, the multitude of options depending on your goals. So in the Minnesota program, it started about 2014, and it didn't start because, and this kind of separates Minnesota from a lot of the other states that have looked at this, it didn't start because of a legislative mandate, governor's directive, or a commission mandate. It started with the stakeholders, including the utilities, getting together and saying, look, we think the world is changing. We think our business model and the traditional cost of service that we've got don't necessarily match up to that. Should we start to talk about what we can do differently from that? The people in Minnesota like to say that they did that because in Minnesota they know how to prepare for winter. So they may be right about that. Although you guys on the first day of spring here have your own to contend with here. So there's a stakeholder group of about 40 people that met once a month for 2 years. And the fact that they kept meeting and the numbers didn't dwindle is a pretty good sign that the folks in there thought that they were getting something out of it. And their first phase was all about what's right about the system, what's wrong about the system, or what would we like to change, what's going to need to change to meet the modern technology changes, customer differences, meet the different load factors that we're seeing. And so they spent the first year just coming up with guiding principles of what everything else could follow from that. What do we go back to? And they wanted also customer-centric kind of focus. They wanted a process that was consensus-driven and to kind of change this traditional cost of service model of build more, sell more, to one of performance, value, and customer options. And so trying to find how to align the revenue with that policy is what followed from that. In part two, phase two, they did a series of smaller groups that each came up with a paper, one of which was on performance-based regulations. And they set goals as well. One was meeting growing customer expectations, reducing real costs over the long term as utilities and customers are incentivized to reduce peak demand and better understand the existing system, sending clear signals to the utilities, a theme we heard earlier this morning, in the form of financial incentives where appropriate to achieve performance outcomes that are aligned with customer expectations and public policy, and meeting the system needs with the least cost, best value option as utilities become more indifferent to who invests in and or is the owner of the solutions to meet such needs. And I know you spent a lot of time talking about that recently as well, about who should own some of the different pieces of the system. In Minnesota, their approach was that even they're a vertically integrated state too, so there's even more control in the traditional utility regulator relationship even than we have in a restructured state like Ohio or like I was in Illinois. But even there, they're talking about how it might make sense for other parties to own different pieces of the distribution, not necessarily the system, but the different pieces that will fit into the distribution system. They also like the idea of the multi-year rate plan, looking at a 5-year action plan. They have an integrated resource planning process, so that could fit nicely into that. And again, the benefits for the multi-year rate plan were set out very well in the WRAP paper that you've got. Metrics could be helpful in a lot of places to go with the multi-year rate plan. One is in distributed energy resources and grid services, which are reasonably valued and supported. In other words, trying to figure out the net benefits of having different choices on there for customers. Utilities have sufficient incentive to manage their controllable costs, particularly their O&M. Overall system efficiency, which gets to things like peak shaving and overall efficiency of the system that David talked about a little bit earlier. And in Minnesota, one of their main goals was to lower the pollution and carbon intensity of the electric system in a cost-effective manner, and get into Commissioner Friedman's question, beyond what's already written into the law, that there already is state standards of what the utilities have to do, but the idea there was to incent them to go even beyond what the law would recommend or require. Increase and enable customer access to a wider range of utility and third-party services and products. This is a huge part of what they've been talking about. So that involves things like not just the ownership issue that we talked about earlier, but also how quickly and how cost-effectively can other services end up getting onto the system. So if you've got integration issues, and this isn't just a Minnesota thing, this was a huge thing in Illinois, where when I was a commissioner, had people come to me and say, the time estimate and the dollar estimate for integrating into the system were off by factors of 10 or more. And so if you have that, then what that does is it quickly discourages people from wanting to do things onto the system, because obviously it's tough from a financing standpoint, it's tough from a business model if they don't know how much it's ultimately going to cost or how long it's going to take them to be able to move their business interests onto the system. So these are all themes that you're seeing that were part of the RAP paper, but also they're things that are coming up not just in Minnesota, but other places too. Things like customer satisfaction, which you can measure through the traditional ways like the J.D. Power surveys and things like that, or you can measure it through the percent of people on individual calls, what the resolution of those are, how quickly, although that one's a little dangerous too, I found out as a commissioner too, because you don't want to just provide an incentive to just end calls quickly, but actual resolution of trying to figure out whatever the customer needs and make that work. So there are lots of different metrics that you could design that would go to that as well. And then the utilities incentivized to achieve the outcomes that are aligned with customer needs and expectations. So the utilities and interveners, regulatory burden also is less through frequent and lower cost rate cases. That's part of the reason for doing the multi-year rate plan. It's interesting, having been a commissioner in Illinois and the legislature decided to hand us formula rates. It wasn't something we asked for. It was something that was done in legislation along with grid modernization back in 2011. The interesting thing about that is that, and of course, the rate cases are less complicated because you're not trying to figure out how expensive it is for a particular utility to go out into the marketplace and get financing. The whole ROE discussion is pretty much wiped out. It's based on the formula. That's what it does. But there's still two different true-ups, one for finances and one for activities that the utility was supposed to do every year. And so for the two major utilities in Illinois, that meant a guarantee of 4 processes every year. So in the name of trying to do something that was going to be more quick and a little bit easier to do, doesn't necessarily do that. Now, there are some that would disagree with that and argue with that premise, but having 4 different commission processes that all come due right before Christmas made for interesting times at the Illinois Commission as well. So trying to figure out the multi-year rate plan, of course, is going in the other direction from that, because you're really, while you're doing true-ups, you're also giving the utilities a lot of incentive to be able to figure out in a way that's not just tied to one particular year's true-up. You're actually giving them a little bit more leeway to try to figure out how to maximize their efficiencies over a longer period of time. So one of the big questions in Minnesota that they wrestled with greatly was, and never did come up with a clear answer, and that's being worked on now, is how much of the earnings should you tie to performance? You know, there's lots of different ways to do this, and I'll talk about Rhode Island in just a second, but how much of the earnings do you tie to performance? So there's kind of a continuum, and if you happen to look at the white paper on performance-based regulation that they did for the E21 process, you'll find this continuum of kind of basic cost of service with maybe a couple of different things like SAIDI or SAFE, the kind of the traditional kind of performance-based metrics, all the way out to the kind of everything's performance-based and then everything, and then there's everything in between, which is, as I agree with David, is where almost everybody else is. And the question becomes, you know, how much of the ROE then is going to be tied to the performance metrics? That's a tough question. But to me, I think going back to what we talked about earlier, it's not as tough if you've done the work up front to try to figure out what your goals are. You know, because that will start to become a little bit more obvious to, if we're talking about these three things or these four things that are really important to us, what are the price signals that we have to send to make them worthwhile for utilities to invest in these and take advantage of the incentives that are out there? Then that question of, it's almost backwards to ask that question up front of how much ROE should be tied to this. That should be one of the last, to me, that should be one of the last decisions based on what the goals are for that. So the basic four principles for any performance metric is tie back to the E21 guiding principles, represent the areas that customers value and deliver benefit for all customers. That's a common theme in Minnesota and in other states. Always keep in mind what the impact is on all the different customer classes, and a special mind to what happens to low-income customers, tied to their state and federal policy goals and which areas are more important to regulators. The interesting thing now is that the PUC has opened up a docket on performance-based regulation, and so we got the stakeholders back together, all the people who filed comments in the first round of the PUC docket, and we're doing a roundtable with them to try to see if there's some areas of agreement that they can come to. And I think one of the interesting ways to look at this came from the Minnesota Attorney General's office, and the rest of this group of stakeholders, which includes the utilities and includes the third-party providers and all the other folks who would necessarily be part of that, the Citizens Utility Board, the consumer advocate in the state, and others. So we got everybody together to try to look at this, and one of the things that they agreed on, or agreed in principle on, was this process that the Attorney General set out, and they did it as kind of in a circular fashion, but with seven different steps. So that was part of the discussion earlier about how do you set these metrics, what are the steps to go through. First is articulate the goals, as we've talked about earlier. Second is ID the desired outcomes, not just the goal, but for anything, you know, it's one thing to say, well, we want the utility to be shave peak. Well, how much? You know, because what programs you design will have a lot to do with the decision of what the desired outcome is. Then ID the performance metrics that will fit achieving those outcomes that relate back to the goals that you've articulated. Then establish the metrics and review them. And at every step along the way, every step in between all of these different landing points, they're recommending stakeholder processes be part of that as well to make sure that you're getting it right. Establish targets as needed, and then establish the incentive mechanism as needed, and then evaluate, improve, and repeat. And so to Commissioner Trombold's question, if you're talking about a layering approach, you don't have to have all 10 metrics or 5 metrics or whatever you decide to do today. It may not work today. You may want to see how one thing, because all of these things are interrelated, you may want to see how one thing turns out before you start down a path on something else. And so setting up just this kind of normalized approach to all of the metrics, I think makes sense. And the other folks in Minnesota thought that made sense as well. In the interest of time, let me just go quickly to Rhode Island and their power sector transformation process, which is a little bit different because this one is heavily driven by the public entities there, it started with the commission, but also with they have in Rhode Island what they call the Division of Public Utilities and Carriers. That's kind of the policy arm for the commission. So they're driving a lot of the work along with the State Energy Office and the governor, who wanted a lot more clean energy to be on the system. And so they're trying to devise their system based on those set of goals to get into that process. So the two primary recommendations that they made with respect to performance-based recommendations or regulation is to improve the performance of the non-monetized outcomes such as customer satisfaction, air emission changes, and system reliability. And second, to stabilize utility bills by addressing economic inefficiencies of cost of service regulation and by mitigating the trajectory of energy costs. They have pretty high rates in Rhode Island, so that's a major consideration to them. So when they start to look at performance-based regulation, and the first thing that they look at is, well, we could give incentives so that the utility could earn more from a rate standpoint, from a customer standpoint, that may not be the most popular thing that they could do. And so what they're trying to look at is, at the same time, to that earlier question we talked about of how much of the ROE are you going to tie up in this? What they're talking about, though, and it kind of goes to David's answer to Commissioner Friedman's question too, they're not talking about it in terms of saying, well, you can only, even if you do really well, you can only get this much out of it. They're allowing for the fact that the utilities may be able to earn more from this process if they hit the goals and do really well, because the idea is that they're performing some things then that are really important for the state, for the customers of the utility as well. They're also looking at a multi-year rate plan in terms of their recommendations. And earnings sharing mechanisms they have talked about it in terms of setting parameters, plus or minus, that if the utility goes above to a certain extent and they earn more, there's one sharing mechanism for that. There's a lesser sharing mechanism. The customer, in other words, would pay less of the share if it fell below, if the utility underperformed on the different metrics. And again, that goes back to David's point. You've got to make sure that whatever you do there is not something that would stop Wall Street from investing in them, or for them being able to get financed as well. They're looking at their performance metrics in three different buckets: system efficiency, distributed energy resources, and network support services. And then they've developed a series of metrics based on for each of those, some of which they've got an idea in their mind of what that particular metric should be, what the cost signal for that should be, and others that they don't yet. And so they're also early on in their process, but they did a lot of work in a very short period of time as well. Let me just talk really briefly about Illinois, and then I'm glad to get questions from you. As again, I said that the major decisions were through the legislature. Both in 2011, the commission, right before I got on the commission in 2010, had agreed to do grid modernization, a lot of grid hardening things for the distribution network, as well as advanced meters. The Attorney General sued the commission and said that the commission had exceeded the authority that they had under the statute, and won. And so the AMI and the grid hardening that the commission had approved was no more, and so it ended up going to the legislature. I used to be a legislator. I can say, in a personal opinion, that's not the best place to do things like this, in my own personal opinion. It's really difficult to get into all of the nuances and all of the intricacies that you all are wrestling with here, and to do that in a legislative fashion for something as complicated as this. So, but that happened in Illinois, and so the grid modernization went on. With that, there were some performance metrics that were tied to that. They're penalty only, and they're on reliability, because that was the purpose of the legislation, was to do grid grid hardening and AMI as well. So there's some penalty for that. But again, how you devise those, how you write those up, can either make them very difficult to achieve or very, very easy to achieve. There's a series of exceptions written into the Illinois law about events that don't count toward missing goals. And so the utilities have had a pretty good record of meeting the performance goals. And again, it's penalty only. But then another one more thing to think about, the last point I'll leave you with, in the new Future Energy Jobs Act that Illinois passed, a lot of it was about supporting the nuclear plants. And we've talked about that at times before, and you've got obviously similar thoughts going on here in this state. Illinois did that, but at the same time, in the same bill, they also fixed problems that were going on with both the renewable energy and energy efficiency programs there. And one of the things that they did, and it goes back to an earlier point that I made, is that they allowed rate basing of some of the expenses on energy efficiency for the utilities. And so what that did was, instead of having them always try to figure out at the end of the year, is the commission going to approve the money that we've spent, it's more of an upfront, we're going to go after these kinds of programs, and it's not based so much on in that particular year of how well that they did. That will affect future years and what they're allowed to do. But I think that allows the utilities there to go out after some of the non-low-hanging fruit in terms of energy efficiency. And the fact that the utility wants to do that, to me, is a pretty good sign there. And I think they'll be able to go after some of the things like combined heat and power that you've worked a lot with here in Ohio, and a lot of other things that are kind of the non-traditional, lighting and some of the other things that are all good, but it's more of the low-hanging fruit that's out there. But Illinois now is actually doing what you're doing through their next grid process, and the key for them, I think, is going to be, what do they do with all the information they get, just like all the information that you're getting now. And again, I would go back to trying to set those goals and try to figure out what makes sense to try to achieve that, and not just say, well, performance-based regulation is pretty good. Lots of people are doing that. Let's jump in with these 20 metrics. I think it's you'll have the opportunity, I think, based on all the information that you've gotten, to try to figure out what will work best here to achieve the goals that you want. So let me stop there, and glad to take any questions.
Very good. Howard, we'll begin with you.
On the subject of multi-year rates, in Ohio, we've had multi-year rates for a number of years. It was accomplished in rate cases where we set stay-out provisions where you couldn't come back for a number of years, and then some of the riders had escalation clauses in them. And the biggest problem that we had, and it goes on both sides of the coin, both utility and the interveners, is when you have the multi-year, is when can you make adjustments? So, for example, the utilities would say, well, this tax reduction, that comes after we set the rate, so we don't have to give back any of the money. And on the other hand, now storm damage, that's unforeseen. That it gets below a certain level that we can have, and the customers are equally as interest focused. On states that have done the limits, what's been the rules for reopening once you've done a multi-year rate?
They vary. As you might expect, they vary. Some of them will allow reopening for certain things only. Some of them will allow openings after a certain period of time. So it's really, there is, again, like with most of this, there isn't any kind of one size fits all. And again, I think it goes back to, especially if you're going to couple that with, the theory being, and I think that was pointed out in the paper that RAP did, that if you couple that, the multi-year rate plan, with some performance-based kind of metrics, theoretically, you should have less of a need to go in and open things up, because you've already set the kind of the goals for it. But you can set whatever you would like to do in terms of what allows for reopeners, or who can reopen. That's also different in certain places. Sometimes interveners are allowed to petition to reopen as opposed to just the utilities themselves. So, sorry, it's not more definitive than that, but did you want to? That's right. Okay.
Any more?
No, that's fine.
Christina? Mr. Snyder?
Yeah, learn how to use the mic here. Is it on? Okay, cool. Hey, my question revolves around PBR and, is there any pros and cons to, Ohio usually has infrequent rate cases, so is there, it seems to me like it can be done within the context of a rider or a rate case. Is there any problems with instituting PBR within a rider and that, you wouldn't be able to evaluate because the rate case is, say, 5 years old and, information there could be stale or old?
Your riders, I assume you're doing more frequent true-ups with those.
Yes,
So
yes, most definitely.
theoretically, no.
Okay.
There wouldn't be any. In fact, in some ways, it may actually be better in terms of if you could find out if you've got a problem a little bit more quickly than you might, and you might have a way to address it that you might not necessarily have in the rate case.
Okay, cool.
Especially if you've got like say a 5-year, if your multi-year rate plan is like a 5-year. Although going back to Mr. Petrikoff's question, you could also tie the two things together too. That if you see kind of a whacked out result, that may be one of the things that you could allow people to come back for early too.
So address in a
Yeah.
future rate case or?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. I mean, a rider, we tend to see a rider as a form of PBR because it clearly sets up incentives for the utilities to do certain things. So a fuel rider, if they're allowed to pass through the cost of the fuel, they become insensitive to that. So then some commissions have realized that and said, we're going to put an efficiency factor in so that they're dispatching efficiently, right, to the most efficient units. That also so that's sort of the second generation. Third generation, which I realize is, well, we've got a lot of renewables on our system, so that efficiency rider now is penalizing the utility for integrating because they have to ramp up and down the units, so we're going to put a factor in for that. So each stage modifies the rider, but the rider itself clearly is setting up incentives.
Very good. Craig, anything?
Sure.
Make sure you hit your mic, Craig. Microphone. Yep.
Many of the innovative products and services are behind the meter, and the outcome of these products and services are adverse to the electric distribution's bottom line, generally. Is the EDU the right vehicle to incentivize for these products and services? Or should we incentivize the market participants or individuals, particularly when the metrics require individuals to act, whether it's time of use or energy efficiency? Are we relying on the EDU to act, to incentivize, even when it's adverse to them, or should we just bypass them?
Well, the question is whether you're going to devise a system that is adverse to them. For example, if you've got a system that says the percentage of customers who are doing X provides an incentive for the utility to do that, and you've already done the work and judged what the benefit is versus what the projected losses would be for the utility, you can design around that particular issue. And different utilities are going to look at that very differently. I mean, I've talked to utilities. I was just on a panel with somebody from a major utility, distribution utility, who said, we don't have any expectation to own those things. That's the other thing that you could do, is you could design it so that anything that even some behind the meter thing, there's some kind of a sharing savings mechanism for that as well. I've seen people try to talk about it in terms of, well, should we just give everybody a Nest thermostat, for example, programmable thermostat, so that we don't have to rely on the customers necessarily. We could just program and go. But you could set up the economics of that virtually any way that you want to. I think, and I agree with the RAP analysis. The statute that you guys got gives you a lot of flexibility that frankly doesn't exist in some other states. So I think you can design around that. All of this is designing around, a lot of the goals that you're talking about are designing around things that are against interest of the utilities. I mean, that's just kind of a basic here, because if you're going cost of service, and you can tell because that's the way, the street tends to look at it, is what's the ROE? It's all based on what's the ROE, how much of is included into the rate base itself. so anything that you do sort of gets away from that. But the purpose of all of this is to design, so, as David said, so that you don't, you can do it in a way that you provide more customer choices, you don't harm the utility in doing it, and you're able to meet other goals, whatever those goals are. So hopefully that answered it.
Okay, Jake? Nope. Okay, Doug, we know where to find you. Okay,
Yeah,
so thank you very
anytime.
much.
I
Thank you very
appreciate it.
much for your presentation.
Thank you
We
so
really
much.
appreciate it. Okay, we are going to move right into our next panel. So we will do a quick, very, very quick scene change here, and then we'll have Sonia, Ryan, and Doug up here next. So we'll take just a 5-minute break. Thank you.